На английский язык, на котором, собственно говоря, и будет проходить наша встреча. Я коротко представлюсь. Меня зовут Дмитрий Харитонов. Я работаю здесь, в библиотеке, в Центре междисциплинарных исследований. Я буду участвовать в вашем разговоре с Лизой, но не как переводчик, а как то, что называется модератор. Разговор у нас будет идти по-английски, поэтому давайте на время забудем о нашем отечественном, прекрасном, нашем родном языке и перейдем на другой язык, что я сейчас и сделаю. Hello, dear guests. It's a pleasure to be meeting you here at our library, the Library for Foreign Literature, and well, foreign literature it is, represented by a brilliant young writer. An accomplished writer. We'll discuss Lisa's book. It's especially great to be doing this now because this is what we do as the Library for Foreign Literature. We are the bridge between countries and people and peoples and books. This is our mission, and it's our pleasure to do this, to discuss contemporary literature in every way it exists. I'd like to thank the Embassy of the United States for making this happen, for making this whole thing possible. Thank you for your cooperation. I hope it will continue in the future. And of course, I'd like to thank Lisa, our guest of honor, for being here with us, for visiting us on her first trip to Russia, right? It's your first time here. Let's hear what Lisa has to say about her fine book. I read the book, and I am telling you completely honestly, I loved it. It's complex, it's fine, it's compelling, it's distressing, it's good literature. Thank you. And now the floor is yours. Yes, please. Actually, I'll give you mine. It's on.
Mm-hmm. In Italy, they call this kind of microphone a gelato because it looks like an ice cream cone. Thank you very much. I am really thrilled to be here. As mentioned, it's my first trip to Russia, and I am just fascinated. My expectations have been exceeded. It is just an amazing place, a beautiful place, and I can't tell you what a privilege it has been for me to be here and to meet so many people like yourselves. Asymmetry is a political novel. It's also a novel about the tension between reality and fiction, reality being a debatable term in itself. It's a novel that many people have described as falling into the genre of autofiction. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. It's often used to describe fiction that invites the reader to consider biographical aspects of the author's own life. It's fiction that resembles autobiographical writing, but at the same time, it often plays with the reader's expectations with respect to those details and what is to come. I didn't actually know this term when I was writing the book. I was really working in a kind of cave for many years, and I wasn't really paying attention to what was happening in the literary world. And indeed, I'm not a theorist. I am just someone who tried to write a novel. I find the term a bit slippery and difficult to understand because, to my mind, all writing has an autobiographical element. All writing is rooted in our consciousnesses, and therefore it has to pass through our experiences. It has to be, when we articulate what we want to say, it's all it's all based on and refers back to what we have experienced in our lives. Even if we are writing about something in a way that acknowledges how little we know about it, that in itself is related to our autobiographies. I think one of the reasons that many people are writing in this trope these days, autofiction is something that has been happening for a while to various degrees, but today people are talking about this genre, I think, in a very dynamic way, an eager way, in part because of the internet, in part because before we read a novel, we are able to Google the author and learn quite a bit about the author even before we open his or her book. And so we have expectations already. And I think writers feel a little bit hemmed in by that, and they want to escape those expectations. They want to subvert them. I myself, with this novel, invited readers to consider aspects of my own life, my own biography, but at the same time, the book deviates dramatically, even in the first half, which is the half most people tend to associate with me and my story. It deviates in the second half even more dramatically. The book is called Asymmetry because it's structurally asymmetrical. It contains 2 long parts followed by a short coda. The 2 long parts are very different stylistically. They're also different in terms of the story that is told in each of them. And yet there are many details that repeat, many details that appear in both, that form tiny symmetries that sort of bind the stories together. There's also a very literal connection to the 2 stories that is revealed towards the end of the book. And I won't be explicit about it today, just in case some of you might actually read the book. Some of the asymmetries that are thematic in the book are East versus West, rich versus poor, young versus old, conservative versus liberal, justice versus injustice, and people who are powerful versus people who are less powerful. The stylistic difference between the first part and the second part is most apparent when we talk about voice. The first part is told in the third person. We learn about a young woman named Alice who wants to become a writer. Like I did, she lives in New York in the early years of the Iraq War. She works at a publishing house. I worked at a literary agency. And she becomes very close to a much older and extremely famous American novelist named Ezra Blazer. This relationship is a kind of education for her. It seems a very unlikely romance in the beginning, but then these 2 people actually do supply each other with true companionship. They share a sense of humor, they share a love of baseball, music, and of course they talk about writing. I wanted the first part of the book to feel to the reader almost like watching a movie. This is one reason why I told it in the third person. We don't have access to Alice's thoughts, or very rarely we have access to her thoughts. We're not told going along what she's thinking about this relationship. We have to sort of guess based on what she notices, the passages from books that mean something to her. We read those alongside her. It's as though we're looking over her shoulder, or as they say, as though we are a fly on the wall to this relationship. And I chose the third person because I didn't want to tell readers what to think about this very unusual relationship. I wanted to allow them to interpret it for themselves. And indeed, many people have different opinions. Some people are very troubled by the relationship, and some people think it's very familiar. Some people have said it feels very familiar, even to one's relationships that they have had. The relationship has been discussed in America and indeed in a couple of other countries as well, more than a couple of other countries, in the context of the Me Too movement. I assume that's understood. And this came as a surprise to me because the Me Too movement was not articulated in a prominent way until just before the book was published. So I had finished it. It was long finished before the Me Too movement was a very current public topic. I don't actually see the relationship in the first part of the book as what you might call a Me Too relationship. These people are in it both willingly, voluntarily. They both want to have it. They both get something out of it. And indeed, the power between them fluctuates it changes hands, you could say. And yet I understand why people have been discussing the book in this context, because there is a power imbalance. Ezra Blazer is a very powerful, established writer, and Alice is still a very young, unestablished, aspiring writer. One of the reasons I invited readers with certain details to think about the writer Philip Roth when they read Ezra Blazer is because Philip Roth, in his work, if you're familiar with it, you know that he played with reality versus fiction. He brilliantly subverted readers' expectations throughout his career. If you know this when you're reading Asymmetry, it gives another layer of meaning to the book. Another reason I invited readers to think about Philip Roth is because I wanted to convey a very dramatic sense of what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence. If Alice is having an affair with a writer who is only of mediocre success, of mediocre talent, it's not nearly as dramatic and interesting as it is if she's having a relationship with someone who, in many people's opinions, is really a giant of literature. So it was useful and deliberate for me to invite people to consider the fact that I actually did know Philip Roth. He was a very close friend until he died last year. And yet, this is a novel. It deviates dramatically from my life, as I've said. Writing fiction, at least for me, is very, very messy. You take details from wherever you can find them. You take the information that you glean from a concert that you go to in 2014 or 2015, and you plug it into a scene that takes place in 2003 or 2004 or 2005. You choose the details from life that serve the story that you want to tell, that create a propulsive, vivid narrative for the reader. It's certainly not a transcription of my life, and I think even when we try to write autobiography, it's never a valid transcription, an accurate transcription of our lives, because our memories are faulty. My version of this evening is going to be very different from your version of this evening, and indeed from every other version that each of you have. We would describe it very differently. In fact, Philip Roth once said that when you write autobiography, they call it fiction, and when you write fiction, they call it autobiography. So if they know so well, let them decide what it is. And indeed, I have had to sort of let go a little bit from the experience that other people are describing in reading the book. I know to what extent it is based on my life, and I know very well the enormous extent to which I had to imagine, invent, recast, recombine events and experiences and impressions in order to create this specific book. I don't know if you're familiar with another book that has been very influential to me in life. It's Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. It's actually for young readers. It's a book that I read many times as a child. One of the characters is Jo March, a woman who wants to become a writer. And she does become a writer, and when her book is published and she reads some of the reactions to it, she says, well, I've got the joke on my side after all, because the parts that I took from real life are being called impossible and absurd, and the parts that I invented with my own silly head are being pronounced charmingly natural, tender, and true. So I wanted to describe a scene that's in the first part of the book. Alice and Ezra have known each other for some time by now, and they are going for a walk, and for the first time they talk about how Alice wants to be a writer. Ezra asks her what she writes about, and she says other people more interesting than I am. And he says, why don't you write about yourself? Why don't you write about your father? They've discussed her father in the past. And she says, writing about myself doesn't seem important enough. He says, what does seem important enough? And Alice says, war, dictatorships, world affairs. He says, forget about world affairs, they can take care of themselves. And she says, well, they're not doing a very good job at it. He also gives her some advice that I like to mention here in Russia, which is that he says, importance comes from doing it well. Just remember what Chekhov said. If there's a gun hanging on the wall in the first chapter, in a later chapter it must go off. Ezra has recently had a defibrillator implanted because he has many health problems because of his age, and Alice replies, if there's a defibrillator hanging on the wall in the first chapter, in a later chapter, must it go off? Anyway, this conversation sets up a discussion of the second part of the book, which, as I said, is very, very different. It's about an Iraqi-American man who is an economist. His parents and his brother were born in Baghdad. He was born on a plane flying from Baghdad to America. He's given an American passport and an Iraqi passport. And in the novel, he is traveling back to Iraq to visit his brother, or rather he's trying to, but he's detained at Heathrow Airport. You might ask, what does this have to do with Alice and Ezra? And it is, in a way, again, I won't be explicit, my response to the question, can you write about things that are very different from you? Can you write about people who are seemingly very, very different from yourself? And indeed, what should we be writing about? What should we choose to write about? Is one subject more important than another subject? Can we only write about ourselves? Do we have to feel limited to our own autobiographies in order to write well or credibly? I don't think that we should be limited to our own biographies. Maybe that's already clear. Cultural appropriation is a term that has been discussed heatedly quite a bit recently. I don't think writers should be told what to write about or what they can't write about. I think it's important to the learning process and important to a dialogue that we feel allowed to write from any perspective, as long as we do it with utmost sincerity and rigor and care and humility. Otherwise, what is the point of fiction if we're limited to our autobiographies when we're writing? It's very interesting to consider that this book has been considered in the context of the Me Too movement, and also that people can talk about it in the context of cultural appropriation, and indeed also in the idea that certain people should not be allowed to travel from certain countries to other countries depending on their presumed religion. This is the theme in the second part of the book. It's also something that has been happening. It's of increasing concern internationally. And the reason I mention these three news topics, these topical subjects, is because it's impossible to read a book not through the lens of the current moment. But if someone reads this book 10 years from now, there will be a different current moment. And we can't know what will be topical then, what will be in the news cycle then. And this is a kind of magic, a kind of alchemy between the reader and the book, but also between the reading experience and a moment in time. This is what we love about books, their capacity to change meaning over time. The words stay the same, but you and the world change constantly. And so books change with you, in a way, in your reception to them. The second part of the book is told in the first person, and this creates the stylistic asymmetry with the first part. It's a kind of explosion of consciousness. We learn Ammar's thoughts. Ammar is the Iraqi-American man. He tells us his opinions, his memories. He describes in great detail his life, his history in the US, his feelings towards his brother, his political opinions, and it sort of turns the book inside out, because as I said in the first part, we don't really have access to Alice's inner world. I said that the first part of the book is not neatly autobiographical with respect to my life. The second part of the book is not neatly not autobiographical, in the sense that, yes, Ammar is an Iraqi-American man, an economist, he's Muslim, I'm a white American woman, I was raised Catholic, and I have never been to the Middle East. But there are many ways in which Ammar's consciousness is my own, or overlaps with my own. Also, I myself was detained at Heathrow Airport once, and I used this detail to imagine the rest of this story. It was a kind of jumping off point. In the second part of the book, there's a passage that speaks to its political nature. It sort of acknowledges the problem with trying to write a novel that is political, And at the same time, I hope to have solved that problem, or at least proposed a path towards solving that problem. Amar remarks that when he's in Iraq, he can't help but think about politics. People are having political conversations all around him, but he's also remembering that something from the novel The Red and the Black by Stendhal. Stendhal said that, or rather a character in his novel says that politics in an imaginative work are like a gunshot in the middle of a concert. They render the work unbeautiful. They disrupt the flow of the narrative. I'm paraphrasing, or at least I'm describing my interpretation of the remark. And I understand this. It can often feel as though an author is lecturing to you or taking a break from the story that you've been caught up in to be didactic. I didn't want this to be the case, but at the same time, I wanted to write a novel that reflected America in the early years of the Iraq War. And it's impossible to do that without talking about politics, without characters who talk about politics. And in fact, in The Red and the Black, a character responds to the first character by saying, if your characters don't talk politics, this isn't France in 1830, and your book is not the mirror that you pretended to be. So how do we write about politics in an imaginative work without boring the reader, without alienating the reader? And I think that the answer has something to do with something that Italo Calvino called leggerezza, or lightness. You have to keep the story moving. You have to weave your politics into the story in a way that feels essential to the story, not a lecture. And Calvino, in fact, described leggerezza, or lightness, as a way to explore very potentially heavy themes, difficult themes, complicated themes in a way that is accessible to the reader, that is actually enjoyable to the reader. I'll finish my contribution for the moment by now citing something that Flaubert said about writing, which is that the task is not to change humanity, but to know it. And I've thought a lot about this, both while writing the book and since. And I think that it's complicated. We can't solve this debate in 30 minutes, and Flaubert and Sartre would not have solved it arguing with each other over the course of 30 years. When you sit down to write, you do want to change humanity. I think it's irresistible. It's irresistible wanting to change humanity even if you're not a writer or an artist. Why else are we here if we're not going to leave some sort of mark or some sort of influence on the world, even just through our personal relationships? But if you sit down to write thinking about changing humanity, you feel paralyzed and absurd because it's such a grandiose ambition. You can't write, or at least I can't. But if you just focus on, as Flaubert says, knowing humanity, studying human relationships, studying your own experiences, interrogating yourself about them, and trying to be as honest as you can and reflecting them in the clearest, most entertaining, but also genuine, sincere way, you communicate a knowledge of humanity that does stand you a chance of changing humanity, because you pull your reader in and you communicate something that the reader is able to connect with, that the reader can find familiar, recognize, even if you're writing about something that is otherwise very new to the reader. And this is how I think you go about the absurd, grandiose ambition of trying to change humanity. You first just try to know it, and sentence by sentence to communicate what you've learned.
Thank you. That was loud. Thank you so much. I have a two-folded question, and I'll just exploit my position. If I may, I'll ask this question, and then I'll ask you, the audience, if there are any questions on your side. And my question is really trivial as a question. This is your first book, this is your first novel, your first and very successful attempt. What was the hardest part?
It took a really long time.
To begin or to
No,
finish?
The whole process took a very long time. I first started trying to write a novel about 10 years before it was finished. I produced a lot of material that I would throw out. I just wasn't happy with it. I would take breaks in order to do freelance work, in order to earn a living, and I did a lot of reading. I was really trying to teach myself about novels and writing. I didn't study it at university. I studied art history. I never took an MFA course. And so it was really, I had to sort of design a program for myself because I wanted to be very comprehensive in figuring out what I liked to read and why. And finally, after several years, I came up with the structure for this book, and even then it took another 5 years in order to write it. Again, I was doing other things. I wasn't just daydreaming, but I was working very hard on freelance work and translation work, proofreading, ghostwriting. Indeed, it's not the first book that I wrote for publication. I've ghostwritten some books and edited in a very you might say invasive way other people's books. So it's not truly the first book I've written, but it is the first novel, which is a whole different can of worms from another kind of book. The hardest part was really finding the structure that served the story and the messages that I wanted to convey. And I think this is so important. I have learned that your content and form need to collaborate, they need to serve each other. And it's very hard to articulate how or why.
This is what Shklovsky said. Shklovsky, the formalist, the Russian formalist. Well, he actually said a more radical thing in a sense. He said that form and content is basically the same thing. There's no difference.
Exactly, it is. It's true. It's true. And so for a long time, I didn't know how to combine Alice's story with Amar's story. I felt instinctively that they belonged in the same book. Some people have asked me, did you just write these two stories and stick them together? That could not be farther from what happened. I wanted them in the same book, and to me they are indivisible. But it took me a long time to find the right structure, and this is it.
Right. Did you want the structure to be, this one is actually silly, the previous one was trivial and this is silly. Did you want the structure to be complex, or it just happened to be, because it is, it requires an effort, for, it kind of exerts an effort from your reader to make sense of the story, to make sense in a good way. It's a profitable effort, but still an effort.
It's not at all a silly question. I didn't want it to be complex, but I did want it to ask something of the reader, and I wanted there to be some drama to it. That is not just drama to the stories that are told, but drama to the. I wanted there to be a bit of suspense, some mystery as to why the book is structured in this way. And I got the idea for the structure from a book that is structured similarly. It's in 2 long parts. And when I read it, it's a book by Jeff Dyer, Jeff in Venice, Death in Varanasi. And when I read it, I was just struck by how these 2 parts play off of each other. They really do something dramatic. You read the first part, and then you start reading the second part, and as you realize how it relates to the first part, you think, this is how life is. Life is not neat and tidy. It's not one narrative that has a neat beginning, middle, and an end. Stories are thrown together. We in one day, we are thinking about different narratives that are proceeding simultaneously in our lives.
Yes, it's messy.
Life is messy. Life is messy, and I wanted to write a book that gave that impression. That wasn't so. I wanted it to be satisfying, but I didn't want it to be satisfying in the neat beginning, middle, end way.
Right. But what was the easy part?
Writing the book?
Yes. This is the second part of the question.
I put a lot of things into the book that I love. I put a lot of music into it. There are many musical references. The last part of the book is a transcript of an interview with the older famous writer in the first part, and he talks about the music that he would take with him to a desert island. That was so much fun to write about. I got the idea for a long time, the first two parts, I was working on the first two parts, and I thought the book would just be those two parts. And then I used to listen to this British program called Desert Island Discs, and I used to listen to it while I was doing the ironing. I still listen to it while I'm doing things around the house. It's the perfect length of time for doing a week's worth of ironing, and I was listening to it and I thought I should create a fictional version of this program with Ezra Blazer as a guest. And it was an opportunity to let him describe in a public way to an interviewer his background, his life story, his favorite music, influences, and also it allowed me to comment through him on, to sort of perform a trick of ventriloquism through him, to comment on what fiction can do, on its limitations, but also on what it can do. And so that was probably maybe not the easiest part, but it was the most enjoyable part, writing the last bit, the coda.
I see. Okay, are there any questions from the audience? No? No questions yet? Yes, you please. There is a hand. And there should be a microphone.
I can speak loud. Thank you very much for your talk. It's been most interesting. And could you say a few words about your daily routine as a writer?
My routine. I'll first describe the routine that I had writing this book. As I said, I had to do lots of freelance work to earn a living, and so I would start the day working on this book. I would try to push myself to work at least 4 or 5 hours on it, and probably the most important thing I did was to turn off the internet, to not allow myself to look at the internet. I would either go somewhere that didn't have internet access, or I would just turn it off on my computer. And if I had to do research using the internet, I would save it for later in the day, because in a way you have to create a temporal zone of boredom for yourself in order to be creative. And so I would do that, and then late in the day, I would do my freelance work, my translating or my proofreading or my ghostwriting or my editing. Sometimes I had to take long breaks from this in order to do that work, and that was frustrating, but also the other work was a kind of apprenticeship. Any kind of work you do, editing, ghostwriting, translating, it's all useful. It keeps the muscle limber. My routine then is different from my routine now because I've had a baby and she necessitates different logistics. So now, of course, I have someone who comes and helps me with her in the mornings, and that's when I have to write. I have to do it during that time. In the past, I could sort of wait to do my 4 or 5 hours later in the day if I was tired in the morning, but I don't have that luxury anymore. And yet, having my daughter, who is just so wonderful, has opened up my attention to so many things that I was not attentive to before. So it's a trade. It's not even a trade-off. It is well worth it that I have had to rearrange the logistics in order to get the time in to write.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay, let's start.
Could you say what are the languages you're working with?
That I work with? Only English and Italian. So obviously English is my first language. I'm American and I'm originally from Massachusetts, but I've lived in Italy for 8 years now. My husband works for an Italian publishing house, and as we were discussing before, I've done some translation. Not very serious translation, but I've done quite a bit of translation from Italian to English. I can read and understand a little bit of some other languages, but really only those. But I do think it's so important to have at least one other language, just a bit of knowledge, because it really opens up your world, and identifying the relationships, the connections between words in different languages, the Latin roots, for example, it makes you so much more nimble as a writer. It's almost like having a thesaurus, sort of, it's like walking around with a thesaurus built into your brain. Learning another language exponentially expands your capacity, your verbal capacity.
Yes. Yes, you please. There should be a microphone over there. Are you sure? Because, okay.
Okay, I have two similar questions. So the first one is, why did you choose the Iraqi war, and what sources did you use to create such an inside story? Because we know about this war from the media, and we don't know such things like what people felt, what they just psychologically, how they acted.
Okay. I chose the I chose the Iraqi war because in the first part of the book, as I said, Alice and Ezra talk about what one should write about. And we gain a sense of Ezra's career as having spanned many, many books that touch on politics and wars, but they're the wars of his generation, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the Korean War. They're wars that he has lived through and processed through the media or through stories from friends. And this is in part why Alice gets the idea that in order to be an important writer, you have to write about war. And for her, the Iraqi war is the war of her generation, her 20s. It's the war she and her contemporaries are talking about. And we have a sense, it's not really made explicit, that she's feeling frustrated by a lack of, a sense of powerlessness about this. We have the sense that she doesn't agree with the motivations for this war. And also there's a kind of frustration in, as you say, you only have information from the media, or the average person only has information from news sources. I also wanted to write about it because at university I met someone who is an Iraqi American, and he became a good friend. He's a brilliant, funny, very sensitive man. We would have long conversations about faith because he grew up Muslim, and I've held on to him in life as a friend because he's just an extraordinary person who is very inspiring and has taught me a lot. This is why I wanted to write about this character, Amar. He was inspired by my friend. There are many, many ways, just as Alice is not exactly me, there are many ways in which my character is not my friend, but it was a starting point. And he would send me emails from Iraq when he would go to visit, specifically in 2005. And I would use details from that to invent the rest of a scene, if you see what I mean. And he advised me to read certain books. He recommended memoirs. I also then would go looking myself for war correspondence memoirs and dispatches, and I watched documentaries. I studied maps. I've never been to the Middle East, but this was part of the creative challenge. Can I write credibly about it, even though I haven't been there? I relied on Google a lot. I took long sort of drives using, Google Street View in order to describe, as I do in the book, how to get from one place to another, places I haven't been to. It was so important to me to do this credibly and sensitively, and again with humility. And I was my own fact checker. I examined every sentence that I wrote really carefully to make sure that there was nothing in there, to the best of my ability, to make sure that there was nothing in there that wasn't correct. And before the book was published, I did give it to my friend, and he liked it. So that was so important to me. It was almost more important than what public reviewers might think. To pass that test meant a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, please.
I would like to ask, what was the most, thank you. What's the most difficult part in publishing a book? That's my question.
the waiting. There are lots of different kinds of waiting involved in publishing. First, there's the waiting to finish your book. And I've talked a bit about, there's a passage in the book, I will come back to the question directly, but there's a passage in the book about an hourglass, the little sand, the hourglass with the sand in it that you turn over to time something. And in the book, I write about how, for example, a great composer like Beethoven, for him, the hourglass gets turned over again and again and again. I think for many of us, we feel that the hourglass is running down, and when we die, that's that. But if you create something that's going to outlast you, a piece of music that people will listen to again and again, or a book that people might read again and again, you stand a chance of that hourglass being turned over every time. And in a way, you're living again and again and again. You're staying with the world somehow. So someone said to me, does that mean that you wish to leave something behind after you die? And of course, I think anyone who tries to create wants that. But for a very long time, the fear was that I would die before the book was finished because it took so long. So there's that waiting, because sometimes you just can't force yourself to write a page in a day because the ideas aren't coming to you. Ideas might come to you, but you're bored by them. They aren't as good as you would like them to be. They're not as smart. Sometimes you just have to let time do some of the work. And then there's the difficulty of waiting when you give it to other people and you're waiting for their reactions. That's excruciating. And there's a lot of that. I was lucky in that when I finally did send my book to a prospective agent, he got back to me pretty quickly in 10 days. That's actually very quick for the industry. But there can be a lot of waiting and wondering, and you have to believe in yourself. There are so many stories, legendary stories, about people who submitted a book for publication and it was rejected by 30 different agents or 30 different publishers. I think Harry Potter falls into this category, and then it has an enormous success. It only takes one agent, it only takes one publisher for your book to be published. And if you really have put a lot of time in, if you really believe in what you've done, it's very hard. Even then, it's hard to hold on to that belief and to think that it was worthwhile when you're waiting to hear. But it's worth submitting and submitting and submitting, getting as many opinions as you can, taking them very seriously. I take criticism very seriously, but I think in a healthy way. I try to make myself and my work better as a result. You can't be too sensitive about it. All criticism, almost all criticism is valuable.
Did you get a lot of criticism along the way?
I mean, I don't mean so much criticism as in this isn't good, or this, but opinions. And you can get 5 different opinions from 5 different people, and it's very important to have your own steady sense of what you're trying to do and take what you agree with and leave the rest, because otherwise you'll be changing your book 5 different times.
Thank you. Yes, please.
What character is your favorite character in your novel? What character do you like? So, and maybe so designed in the best way, please.
I really like that question. And I'm afraid I'm going to give a very unsatisfactory answer. I try to write realistic characters in that they each have flaws. None of them is perfect. Each of them behaves badly at one moment or another. But they also all want to improve. And so there are pages in which I love one and I'm not so happy with another one. I tried to be really very generous to each of them. I tried to really view, I knew that people would associate me with Alice, and I tried to be even harder on her than I might on the other ones, because I really wanted it not to, I think you can tell when a writer is trying to rewrite history or or rehabilitate herself or himself through a character. And it doesn't work. It's too obvious. So I really tried to think about Alice and indeed Ezra and Amar as people I felt warmly toward and sympathetic toward, but also who behave badly, because that's realistic. And it doesn't mean you condone the behavior, but if you don't include it, it's not an accurate reflection of what humans are actually like.
There is an elderly lady in your book, and I was moved, immensely by this character. Could you please say a few words on her role, on her position in the structure?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a big achievement in itself.
Oh, well,
Yes.
Thank you. I actually thought of naming her fleetingly in response to your question, but that would have been a bit of a cop-out, because it's in part because she's relatively minor. She's an elderly lady who lives down the hall from Alice on the top floor of a brownstone in Manhattan. They live in a rent-controlled building, which means that their rent doesn't go up very much. It's according to a law in New York that helps keep apartments affordable, although I don't think it applies to many apartments any longer. But anyway, this lady lives alone down the hall from Alice, and she frequently knocks on Alice's door and asks Alice for help of some sort, like changing the bag in her vacuum cleaner or changing a light bulb. And she seems to be getting a bit forgetful, and sometimes Alice gets the sense that this woman is knocking on her door above all because she's lonely. And Alice begins to wonder, where is this woman's family? Why is it that she's the one who's doing this again and again? And in a way, what I was trying to do with this character was a few things. I wanted to convey a sense of some of the dreariness of her life away from Ezra. So when she's with Ezra in this exciting affair, she doesn't have this problem. She's in his apartment, they're talking about literature, he's famous, and she's forgetting about this problem among many other problems that she has as a young woman living in New York. But also she's very sympathetic towards Anna, and in a way the relationship with Anna, because Alice is a kind of caretaker and a companion in a way that asks too much of her, it sort of foreshadows what would happen with Ezra if she stayed with him. So in the course of the book, Ezra, for the most part, is still a dynamic person. Alice still gets a lot from him, but if she's going to be with him for the rest of his life, he might turn into Anna. And so it's a sort of parallel subplot that I hope conveys some of that, and also is just a bit of New York atmosphere, because I think these kinds of relationships with close neighbors are very common.
Thank you. That's one of the most beautiful parts, actually, in the book. The saddest and the best. Okay. More questions? Yes, please.
You said that even though it's your first published novel, it's not your first experience in writing. And have you ever experienced the fear of the plain paper? And how did you manage that?
I do. I will on Monday when I go home. Every day you experience this fear. And you have to find psychological tricks to play on yourself. You have to tell yourself it doesn't matter. You have to just start small and say, even if I spend 5 hours today and I only write one sentence, that is okay. As long as I'm happy with that one sentence, that is enough. Otherwise, you just lose faith and you feel so demoralized and you can't go on. And, I did know, as I've said, Ezra Blazer is based to an extent on Philip Roth, whom I knew, and who communicated to me frequently how difficult writing was for him. He wrote over 30 books. He won many, many, many prizes. He's considered by many people to be a giant of literature, and it was hard for him. And learning this was in part what gave me the confidence to try writing myself, because I thought, if it's hard for him, and it's hard for me, maybe I'm doing something right. So I like to tell this story because I think everyone who's trying to write, and I imagine at least a couple of you might be trying, it's okay if it's hard. That probably means you're good at it because you're not satisfied with the first thing that comes into your head. You know, writing is very different from tweeting. It requires a lot of contemplation and consideration and self-censorship, but also a belief in yourself that you can do it. So I still always am afraid of the blank page. And sometimes what I do, I'll give a bit of practical advice as well. Before I quit the day before, I print out what I've done, even if it's terrible, and it usually is terrible the first time. But then at least you have something to work with, and you go over it. I find writing by hand or editing by hand helps my brain work a bit more liberally. And then you type up what you've done and you print it out again, and then at least you have something that shows, you have something to show for the hours you spent the day before. But if you feel that fear every time you sit down to write, don't let that be the reason you stop.
Let me scare you a little more by reminding that there has to be a thing maybe that one could call the second novel scare or
Yes.
something, because
Yes.
After one has published a successful first novel, there has to be something ahead.
There doesn't have to be. I could stop, but I
but would
I
you?
won't.
Would you?
But I won't. But I could stop. It can be very frightening. You just have to put it out of your mind and figure out what the next book is that you want to write and do the best you can. There are going to be people who say, "Oh, I liked the first one better." That's inevitable because now there is something to compare it to. With your first novel, you're a surprise to people. You know, they don't have something to compare it to. But now there's a standard, and
expectations.
And expectations, and also a time. I did feel a kind of time pressure the first time around, but I feel it more now, and of course now I also have my wonderful daughter, who
How old is she?
She's almost 2. Thank you. And I must dedicate quite a bit of time to her, which is a joy. It's a privilege, but
it's different.
It's different.
Thank you. More questions, please? Yes.
So, yeah, I thought of one more question. How do you feel about translators' work? So, if a translator adds something from himself to the book, I mean, not like add some parts that are not there, but, well, when you're translating, you are paraphrasing some things and they feel not the same as they were. So is it good? Is it bad that the translator doesn't convey the author's initial intent? Is it all right?
And is it inevitable?
It is it's inevitable because a different language is a different language, and you can only get so close to the original. It varies from translator to translator. The translation of my book that I feel closest to is the Italian, because I had an excellent translator, and then I was able to read it carefully and have a dialogue with her through an editor. We didn't actually meet, but I met frequently with an editor at the publishing house, and we talked about passages, we talked about word choices. I was able to say, I'm not sure this was understood precisely. What about this instead? And in some cases, I was told that doesn't sound natural in Italian. And I deferred to that opinion, but there were some cases where what I suggested was better or closer to the original. And that was a privilege to be able to do that. I live in Italy, I live half an hour away from the publishing house. To be able to do that was really a wonderful experience. I know enough of some other languages to be able to check certain things. In the book there are certain jokes or references to baseball or just very, very precise examples of wordplay that are so hard to translate, and I really feel very sympathetic and guilty, sympathetic towards the translators. So I've actually, having looked at a number of translations of the book, I've created a kind of checklist, and I go through and I look just to see how they've done it. And it's thrilling to see the cleverness that has been applied to solving these problems. And in some cases, I have been moved to say, I'm not sure this is right. Is there an alternative? And sometimes I have to accept that there isn't a better way of putting it. I often like to tell people about when I went to Amsterdam and Utrecht last fall. I was in a room with a man who had read my book in Dutch. It had come out recently. And he said to me, there's a very, very funny joke in the beginning, in the very first pages, and it hinges on a character who mispronounces Hawaii as Hawaii. And it's not worth my explaining the whole joke, but in the Dutch, instead of Hawaii and Hawaii, they've used Stockholm and Stockholm. And the man told the joke to the other people in the room in Dutch, and they all laughed uproariously. And then he turned to me and he said, now you tell it in English. So I read the joke out of the book that I wrote, the original version, and no one laughed. And it was just so interesting. It was very funny for me. It was so interesting to think, you know, it has really taken on its own life, and I'm not needed anymore. In fact, I'm not even really wanted because
and
it's funnier in the
book,
Dutch.
in a sense. But you didn't get the feeling that a lot had been lost in translation, because you know the saying that poetry, prose in your case, but still, nonetheless, poetry is what is lost in translation. Do you think that?
I don't know the other languages well enough to really be able to tell. I don't think so.
Italian ways.
You can tell sometimes, but you just have to accept it. And actually, I am much more focused on feeling grateful that it's been translated into lots of languages, and that is a gift to me. The idea that people in other countries can read it thanks to the work of the translators, I'm very grateful and appreciative for that.
And speaking of other literatures, what's with all the Russian quotes? Chekhov, okay, but you quote Osip Mandelstam, one of the most, obscure Russian poets of the canonical status.
I can
So
tell you the
how
origin
come-
of that.
how come?
So another college friend of mine is a Russian literature scholar, a writing teacher in New York, and he writes himself. He writes fiction, and he and I were having a conversation many years ago, and I said, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "There's a Mandelstam line that I give when people ask me this question," or something like that. And I loved the line. I don't know if I should take the time to find it, but it's a beautiful line, and I gave it to. Yes, I'll find it. Maybe you can talk about yourself.
I'll find the quote. I know.
Oh, okay.
I remember.
It's a good example of you hold on to things in life that mean something to you, that express something in a way that you never could have yourself, and so I gave it to one of the characters in response to the question. Very good. So this is Amar is he's actually in a hotel in Baghdad, and he's at a war correspondent's Christmas party. And he and a friend of his who is a war correspondent, a foreign journalist from London, they're talking about faith and God. So let's see. So the war correspondent is talking about how he's confused because he is thrilled and excited by war, but at the same time he recognizes that this is problematic. And he says, "You think about how we all belong to this species capable of such horrifying evil, and you wonder what your responsibility to humanity is while you're here, and what sort of game God is playing with us. Not to mention what it means that generally you'd prefer to be back in Baghdad than at home in London with your wife and son reading If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, which is a very popular children's book. If I am unnerved by peace and contemplation, if something biochemical in me craves the stimulus of violent spectacle and proximity to conflict, where am I on the spectrum? What am I capable of under another set of circumstances? How different am I really from them, meaning from people who wage war? So Amar says, I didn't know you believe in God. And the war correspondent replies, I don't, or rather, I'm agnostic, a foxhole agnostic. There's a Mandelstam poem that goes, your form agonizing and fleeting, I couldn't make it out in the haze. God, I said by mistake, without having thought to speak. That about sums it up.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. You said it was your first novel. Why did you decide to write about politics, which is not a very easy topic to write about, and it's very challenging for your first book to be published? Because I think politics is the most common topic to be talked about by very common people. So why would you go so hard on yourself?
Yes. Well, first of all, I like a challenge. But as I said earlier, I think it's, if you want to write a book that is a reflection of a time period and a place and the people who lived during that time, if they're talking politics in real life, you have to have politics in the book. And so then the challenge is how to do it in a way that isn't obnoxious and lecturing. So I wanted to write about America and Iraq during the first decade of this millennium. So it had to be political. But also, it just interests me. In a way, it was a kind of reckoning with my own conscience, because I was not happy with what was going on politically in the United States during that time. I was very frustrated. I didn't think we were headed in the right direction. And there are different ways that you can address this sense of impotence and frustration. For me, it was through writing. Other people might become activists. Other people might dedicate time to getting people out to vote in the way they would like people to vote. We all deal with it in a different way. Sometimes I think writing is the cowardly way, but it's the way that I chose. And for me, writing is the easiest way to articulate myself. That's not to say it's easy, but it's easier for me than other forms of communication. And then I wanted also to, with a novel you can do something different. As you say, many, many people talk about politics, and of course it's all over the news, everything, politics it touches everything. With a novel you can try to do something different. You can tell a story and the politics come through obliquely. And I think that's why we like novels, because they make us see things from a different angle from the way a news cycle shows it to us, or even just conversations with friends.
Speaking of politics a bit more, there's a hilarious character in your book, Alice's father, who would believe in every single conspiracy theory that's out there, that exists. Didn't mean to satirize or just to have some fun, to alleviate in a way, the gravity of things, or what?
We just have tiny, tiny hints of what Alice's father is like. And we understand that he owns guns, and he believes in certain theories about, for example, the World Trade Center, about, I think it's mentioned...
yes, it's about the Jews. So
yes,
it's kind of exotic in a sense that...
It shows that Alice has an influence in her family life that is perhaps why she's looking for a different influence in the form of Ezra Blazer. So Ezra Blazer becomes a kind of father figure to her in addition to everything else, and we understand that this is because she's gone looking for this. But there's also a line that hints at the complexity of her feelings about her father, and yet there's very little in the book about him, so I'm impressed that you mentioned him. And
he's funny, and he's memorable, actually.
And as I described, when Alice and Ezra talk about what one should write about, Ezra even says, "Do you write about your father?" And she says, "No." And he says, "Why not? It's a gift." And he clearly thinks this is what she should be writing about, but we come to understand that Alice is not ready to do this. And she says, "Writing about myself doesn't seem important enough." And maybe there are other reasons as well, just not being able yet to grapple with it. So those are some of the reasons. But also, there are lots of connections between the two sections that many people won't get, and indeed no one might get other than me. And one of them is that in the second part of the book, when Amar is talking to people in Iraq and they're expressing their frustration with the invasion by America and the UK and how little it has brought them, their expectations are not being met. And it seems that more problems have been created than solved. And one of these Iraqis says to Amar, you sent a man to the moon. Your men walked on the moon. We know you could fix this. If Americans can put a man on the moon, in fact, decades ago, why can't they solve this problem in the Middle East that is Iraq? And to me, that's a kind of echo back to the conspiracy theories because
She says that no man ever walked the moon.
Exactly. It's actually a pretty popular conspiracy theory that man actually did not walk on the moon and that the video was invented, was fabricated. So that's just one of many places where there's a faint echo from the first half.
Thank you. More from you? Yes, please.
Lisa, thanks again. My question might seem maybe too technical. Now it's not about maybe so much literature, and might seem maybe scrupulous, but really for me personally it's important. So I hope you understand what I'm talking about. Some certain words in the text of your book, of other books, are typed with not like normal, let's say, like some words are capitalized, italicized, or parceled, like, for example, simple example from your text, caller ID blocked, capitalized, and it repeats throughout the text. So you understand what I'm talking about?
Yes.
This play with print, with type and spelling. So my first question is, do you believe it's semantic, this choice? And the second question is, who's doing this choice? You as the author of the text of the book, or the book designer, the person whose responsibility is the design of the printed page? Thanks a lot.
It's a question that actually is very close to my heart because I am a scrupulous person when it comes to these things, and they were absolutely my decisions. And whenever my publisher sort of failed to carry something over, I made sure it was changed back. They all mean something to me. Every sort of letter, every word in the book is a decision, and for caller ID blocked. So when when Ezra calls Alice on her old-fashioned cell phone, it says caller ID blocked. His number is not going to show up because he's famous and he's arranged things this way. That's how it looks. It's in all capital letters on her phone, and it gives it a kind of, it gives it a more formidable look than if it were in lowercase. It makes clearer to the reader that this is what Alice sees. She's seeing it in all capital letters, and it has a more imposing look to it. And then there are also passages from books, and I think most of those are in cursive lettering, and that was to convey the kind of slightly dreamier tone of when you're reading something, when you're absorbed in a book, but also to make clear that this is not a continuation of what I've written. It's an excerpt from a book that Alice is reading, for example, from Huckleberry Finn or from Camus or other books that Ezra recommends that she reads. And then, for example, Ezra spells out some words. This is something that he does throughout the book. He has a habit of using a word and then spelling it for his listener to make sure that that the listener knows which word he's talking about. And so at one point he says to Alice, you must be reeling, meaning you must be sort of like this because you're shocked. And he says not reeling, R-E-A-L-I-N-G, and it's spelled out with the hyphens, but reeling. And it's funny that he does this because who would think he meant reeling with an A, because that's not a word. But also it puts in, he says, which isn't a bad word actually. So he's, it just heightens that it emphasizes that he's a writer, he plays with words, he thinks about new words, he invents words. And not only has he invented a word here and then made sure that Alice doesn't think that he used this invented word, but it's a word that invokes the idea of real or reality. And the book plays with that a lot, that idea. So anyway, every typographical decision was made by me, was experimented with by me. And actually, at the very end of the book, in the interview, there are these little patterns of asterisks. When I explain that the interview is one in which Ezra is asked what music he would take with him to a desert island. And on the actual radio program, Desert Island Discs, they play little pieces of the music. And I had this problem, which was, what do I put in the book when the music is playing? I could describe the music, but I think that would be heavy and boring for the reader, and I didn't really want to do it. I could say music playing, but that's silly. So I had to come up with a solution, and it took a long time. And I was looking at the original Alice in Wonderland, because there are many references to Alice in Wonderland in this book, including the very first sentence, Alice is named Alice. And I was looking at the original Alice in Wonderland, and there are these little patterns of asterisks, 3 rows of little stars, that indicate when Alice in Wonderland is, for example, crossing a stream, or when there's a chess move being made. It indicates a kind of transition. And if you go home and look at your own Alice in Wonderland, it's in there. And I copied that pattern exactly for each time a music passage is being played. And I have checked every single edition, every single translation, to make sure that they're exactly as I intended them to be, which is exactly the way they are in the original Alice in Wonderland books. For me, this is part of the writing. I wouldn't let the publisher change things.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Now that's meticulous.
It is meticulous, but also I do think I'm polite about it. I'm not.
Okay. Yes.
Can I just add? Yeah, I'm sorry. And do you think this is the same case about other authors, or just because you are so careful about it?
No, many authors are this way. Many people are writers precisely because they like to control everything. It's a sort of vessel for all of the controlling that you want to do. I put a lot of my compulsion to control, which is a fault, really, into writing, and then I don't need to do it so much in the rest of my life. I think many writers are this way, many artists are this way, composers are this way. They control things to a very tiny degree. Not all of them, but I think many of them do.
Thanks.
Thanks. You told that Alice and Ezra, they share a lot of interests, music, writing, baseball, but still they don't share very private things with each other. Like Alice talks about her father with an interviewer to be in a jury. And he talks about his children at the very end of the book in the interview for the program. So why did you do that? To show that it's easier to share with a stranger, or just to show the other probably shade of their relationship?
Well, it's a very astute question. I think it is possible, first of all, that Alice and Ezra do talk about these things, but they don't do it in the scenes that are in the book. Sometimes we have hints that they've talked about something, but we haven't actually been present for that conversation. I think that's a possibility. But also, she does talk to him about her father, and then her stepfather comes up in the interview with the juror, and it's a good question. I think it seemed to me unnatural, or that it would slow things down if every topic was discussed by them, and in a way, if everything is discussed in the first half of the book, when it comes up later, you already know it. It slows down the momentum. It creates a kind of drag effect on the book. And so there's that. But also, I think that they do also censor themselves a bit when they're together. But we all do that. And it's tempting to say that it's because of the age difference between them, or the hopelessness of the relationship ultimately because of the age difference. But we all withhold things from people, especially in the beginning of relationships. A relationship, in a way, is exciting because it feels like a chance to be a new person, or even just a slightly new person. And you emphasize different things with different people. And sometimes we don't talk about things because they're painful and we just don't want to. So I don't know. I truly don't. You can also not know everything about your characters. And I honestly don't know if Alice doesn't learn from Ezra about his children, who are mentioned at the end of the book. I don't know. I like that I don't know.
First of all, thanks a lot for this amazing public talk, and I can't wait to read your book because the presentation is so amazing and so sincere. And I have three short questions. First, who are your favorite American and Italian writers or playwrights? Maybe Paul Auster, Niccolo Machiavelli, or Luigi Pirandello? Just a guess.
American writers, I really like John Updike, John Cheever, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Louise Erdrich, Zadie Smith. Louise Glick is a poet. She's also a good friend of mine, but even if she weren't a friend, I would say you should all read her work. There's actually an enormous volume of her poetry from 1962 to 2012 that came out a few years ago, and she's just a wonderful poet. She was the poet laureate of the United States several years ago. And they have all been influential for me. I relied a lot on, you didn't ask about French, but I relied a lot on Flaubert when I was writing this book. I studied Madame Bovary because Flaubert in that book manages to convey what Emma Bovary is thinking and feeling without telling you she's thinking this, she's feeling this. He does it through impressions and the details that she notices. And that was what I was trying to do in the first part of this book. A German writer I really like is Sebald. Italian writers, Calvino, I mentioned, has been very influential for me. Antonio Tabucchi, who was also a friend before he died a few years ago. Giorgio Bassani. I also really like Turgenev. You didn't ask about Russian writers, but I've sort of studied, I mean, not formally, but I've studied the work of Turgenev for my own purposes, and Chekhov. And playwrights, I don't really read plays. I mean, I go to them, but I didn't, and I took a course in college on contemporary playwrights, but I don't really read them. And yet, it's funny, when I was working on this book, I was, it's a long story, but I was renting an apartment. I had sublet my apartment in New York, and I was renting an apartment in Paris in order to be close to my British boyfriend who was in London. But I couldn't go to London as a result of having been detained at Heathrow. So he had to come to Paris to visit me on weekends. Anyway, I had first started to experiment with working on this book. And you'll notice that there's a lot of dialogue. In the first part, there's a lot of dialogue, and in the second part, there's a lot of dialogue between Amar and the immigration officer who was questioning him. And I was working on the book, and I would email to, in this little apartment that I rented in Paris, and around the corner there was like a photocopy place, and I would email them the pages that I worked on in the course of a day so that they could print it out for me, and I could take it to a restaurant and look at it at night. And I went one day, and what they'd printed out for me was long pages was 4 or 5 pages of just dialogue, answer question, and the man said to me, the playwright. You're here to pick up your play. And it was so funny to me because, of course, I didn't think of what I was writing as a play, but of course it looked like that to him. So
Or screenplay.
or a screenplay, yes. But I have no idea how that works. And actually, Asymmetry has recently been picked up by a woman who's going to try to make a series of it. And
Congrats.
I have no idea how she's going to do it, but I'm thrilled that she's going to try.
And my second question is, now that you're a mom, do you consider writing a children's book?
I never, ever, ever considered it previously, but now, this isn't a serious contemplation, really, but I think about it occasionally. I think about what makes a good story. I read to my daughter all the time. She's very bossy about, when I read to her, she doesn't, even when I'm very tired and I'm trying to move through it quickly, she's very insistent that we look at every page for 5 minutes. And it's so interesting to notice what she notices and what's important to her. And Louise Erdrich, who I mentioned as a writer, I like very much. I interviewed her for the Paris Review many years ago, and we talked a bit about children's books because she writes for children as well, and she has many children. And she said some really interesting things about there always has to be a major loss or a death, but it can't be too dark. There has to be hope at the end. There has to be a kind of redemption. And she said something very funny. I don't know if you're familiar with Cormac McCarthy, but he writes very dark books. She said, I can't become Cormac McCarthy for the middle reader, for the young reader.
And my last question is about baseball, actually. So how often do you go to stadiums? Red Sox, Yankee Stadium, or Citi Field? Which one is your favorite?
Fenway Park. I grew up in Massachusetts. My family is still there.
Boston?
Boston, yes. And a detail that is consistent with my life is that my grandmother really loved the Red Sox, and when I grew up, we used to go to Fenway Park together. She died a couple of years ago, and it was so hard for me because we were really, really close. She taught me to love baseball, and she was a true fanatic about it. She used to shout at the television screen, and I love it, and it's so American. That's another reason why I really wanted to incorporate it in the book.
National pastime.
It's the national pastime, and it gave me pleasure to write about it. Although a lot of Yankees fans gave me a lot of, they didn't like the baseball bits so much only because they're Yankees fans and I'm not.
Anything else? Anyone else? Okay,
Thank you so much.
No. Let me ask the final question. Did writing this book make your life easier or harder?
No, I think when you undertake something like this, and while you're doing it over the course of 10 years, you have all of these fantasies about how if you ever do finally finish it, and people read it, and people like it, you have these fantasies about how life is going to be better in certain ways, but it just isn't the case. You have to. I don't mean to sound. I'm very, very grateful for many things that have happened as a result of the book being published. However, it doesn't make it any easier to write. and you are still you. You know, I have other, there are other problems that come in to take the place of the previous ones. And you really have, the point is really that you have to love the process. You have to love the writing and not just be writing for the final result and the reception, because that's a tiny, tiny part of it. It is such a small part of the job.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we should call it a day unless there's a question, please. Yes, we still have a couple of minutes.
Have your book been translated or being translated into Russian? Because it was very, well, I did manage to find it in Russian, but thanks to Kindle.
You did find it in Russian? Oh, you didn't, okay. I was surprised. No, I've been asked many times this week, and the answer is it does not yet exist in Russian. It exists in many other languages, including Polish, but it does not exist in Russian, and I hope that one day it will.
Thank you so much. No, please. No, that's okay. We still have time, yes.
A way to contact you on the email, or maybe you have a website where the readers can ask you questions to have your vision, to give their feedback, because in future perhaps I would like to give some feedback.
I don't have a website. I don't actually use social media because I just don't have time to. But we can speak afterwards, and I can give you maybe my agent's email, and that's a way to be in touch.
Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else? No. So, thank you.
May I say thank you
Yes.
now? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.